Our Health Friday conversation today is going to be on clinical research and cancer care in Kenya, and we're joined by Professor Mansoor Saleh. Professor is the founding director at the Aga Khan University Cancer and Clinical Research Unit. Prof, good morning.
Asante, thanks for having me here.
Karibu sana. That's the hot seat of the Situation Room. How does it feel?
I see that. It feels very warm so far.
Karibu.
Very early to be warm, but I'm ready.
Very good. You'll tell us about your center and what the Aga Khan University is doing in terms of just research into the area of cancer. But to welcome you to the conversation is Bonasiti Muga, and he will give you the day's proverb.
Yes, our proverbs for the whole of this week have been from the island republic of Sao Tome and Principe. As in English, we were told the other day that the pronunciation, since it is Portuguese, is Sao Tome e Principe. But Sao Tome and Principe. A devil with fine manners can only carry you to hell. That is the proverb.
A devil with fine manners can only carry you to hell.
Yes.
Prof, what's your interpretation of this proverb?
Well, be careful who you take your company with. I think that should be my interpretation.
Watch out. Who you hobnob with.
Yes. Don't be taken in by the appearance.
Yes. Smiling. Giving you all the sweet things.
Understandable, talking well.
Yes. Buying you drinks.
Giving you chocolate.
Giving you chocolate. you may just end up in hell. Okay. Prof, tell us about your unit, the Cancer and Clinical Research Unit at the Aga Khan University.
So, I was born in Zanzibar many decades ago. I am the child of a revolution. I was there during the revolution. I spent a few days in prison, went to school in Tanzania, came to Kenya to do my high school, and then went to Germany to study medicine, and then went to the States. What I realized that the paradigm change is we used to treat cancer with the machine gun. You shoot whatever divides, but in the process, you lose hair, you drop the blood counts, you become immunocompromised. So the future of oncology care is targeting those aspects of your gene that are responsible for cancer. So it's not organ specific, but target specific.
Okay.
So after all that, I thought only 1% of clinical trials are conducted in Africa. We had no clinical research unit in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. I thought I could come back home and do this just as well I could do it in America. And the clinical research unit is a reflection of the desire so that we in Africa can conduct clinical research on our people for our people so that the drugs we get from the West are tested on us before we get them commercially.
Please say that again. There's something that you've said, that we did not have a clinical research unit for cancer in the region and in Africa.
Correct. If you look at, we have data from 2019, there were about 700 trials conducted in Africa. Only 26 were cancer clinical trials. Of those 26, 20 were conducted either in South Africa or Egypt, where we do not have African patients, and only 6 were conducted in sub-Saharan Africa. We wanted to change that paradigm. And in fact, we have a study whereby we tested the genes of Kenyan women who have this aggressive form of breast cancer called triple-negative breast cancer. I took the tissue from Kenyan women, took it to Alabama where I trained, compared it to African-American women in Alabama and white women in Alabama. And we see hotspots in Kenyan women with triple-negative breast cancer not present in African-American or Caucasians. Our genes are different. The drugs for us may be well different than the ones that come from the West. The only way to find out is to be part of clinical trials here in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is what the clinical research unit does.
Do I hear you to be saying, Professor, this is mind-boggling or mind-alerting, that because there were not adequate clinical trials conducted with regards to the treatment of cancer in, say, in sub-Saharan Africa, whatever drugs that we have that have been availed for that treatment may not necessarily be the most suitable given our genetic makeup. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, and we have to be careful in science, We haven't tested them. They seem to work very well, but it's quite possible that we may have more side effects, that the benefit may be different. And I will give an example. I was part of a clinical trial in North America. It's like a growth factor to grow your platelets. Platelets are those cells that help you stop bleeding. So when you cut yourself, the first time you ooze a little bit and then it stops. The platelets are the ones that stick and stop you from bleeding. Okay. And then there'll be a clot. So clearly platelets are important. So there are some diseases where the platelets are low, they're being destroyed in your body. You have bruising, bleeding, you brush your teeth, you start bleeding. So we have a growth factor that is given to increase your platelet count. The FDA approved 50 milligrams per day as the right dose for that condition. There were about 14 patients in Hong Kong because one of the investigators was from Hong Kong. So the eligibility criteria was a platelet count less than 20,000, you're eligible for the study, you enroll the study. The objective was to get the platelet count to 100,000, which is in the normal range. And 50 milligrams was the right dose for Caucasians. Those 14 patients, there were about 20% of those patients who had 50 milligrams, their platelet count went to 1 million.
What?
They were supposed to get to 100,000, it went to 1 million, and those million platelets caused clotting. So here we are treating bleeding, and then all of a sudden we form these white platelet clots. And the FDA has a black box warning on that particular drug that says if you are of East Asian ancestry, take half a dose. And my question is, should the Kenyan take a quarter dose, a full dose, or a double dose?
Yeah.
The genetics of the makeup of the individual determines how you metabolize the drug. And when we go to talk about the gene, the genetic makeup of the Kenyan patient may well determine what drugs are right for them, because we are going from a machine gun approach to a precision medicine approach that targets the gene responsible for your disease as opposed to the manifestation of the disease.
Okay. What stage is clinical trial at currently?
So there are three forms of clinical trials. You know, you have a drug, and it could be for anything, diabetes, hypertension, etc., that is tested in the test tube, tested in animal model, then it gets to a patient. When it comes to a patient for the first time, it's called first in human. That's what I did when I was training in Alabama. So that's phase 1. You determine there what is the least toxic dose that the patient might tolerate. So that's phase 1. No efficacy being tested, just the right dose. Phase 2 is the right dose being looked for efficacy. And phase 3 is you compare what is currently available today with the new drug and to say which is better. We at the Aga Khan University CRU conduct phase 1, 2s, and 3s. When I came to Kenya, I was absolutely sure we would set up a unit as good as the unit in Alabama. We can do at least phase 3 trials where we compare new drugs to old drugs, because those are less, I would say, high risk, because the side effects of the drugs are known. You know the known drug approved by the FDA. The new drug has gone through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We just about 6 months or 8 months ago started our first phase 1 study in the history of Africa, where we block a specific gene called KRAS G12C. 10% of Caucasian patients who have cancer have this mutated gene. And if you have that mutated gene, you have a 90% risk of getting cancer. We have a pill today, approved in the West, to block that gene in lung cancer. And the study we had was you take any cancer available in Africa that you see in a patient who's failed conventional therapy. If they have that gene, we have a pill to block the gene. Well, we thought 10% in the West, we would get at least 10 patients out of 100. We've tested 100 patients. We only got one patient who was positive for the gene, and that patient was not Kenyan or Ugandan. We are just treating our second patient, a young girl from Ethiopia, who has the gene, has failed 5 prior therapies, coming to us to get this pill that blocks the gene, and we have a PET scan that shows within 14 days her tumors are shrinking down because we can block the driver mutation. But it's not as common in Africa as we thought it would be. So my question is, test our genetic makeup before you bring drugs to us. And one of the reasons we in the clinical research unit are looking at that is we want to establish a genetic sequencing platform where we can test the gene of the African patient population to say what are the driver mutations for our diseases, not just cancer, but diabetes, high blood pressure, because they all have a genetic source before they become manifested as an ailment.
So essentially, are we saying that this process that you're asking for, test the genetics in Africa before you bring or you sell us the drugs that we're going to use to treat particular diseases, does this process then take place in the jurisdictions where Big Pharma is providing these drugs? Do they take place there in that manner?
Well, often pharma is a for-profit entity. You have shareholders, so they want to study a drug quickly, get it approved quickly, and be able to put it commercialized. The FDA in the U.S. requires that at least 10% of the population studied should be minority.
Mm-hmm.
Even in America, only 4% of clinical trials enroll minorities. And there are no Africans on those clinical trials, which is what we are saying is, come to Africa. We have facilities as good as in North America, and we can provide you our patients to test the drugs on so that when you sell them commercially, we can say with good faith, they also apply to our patients here in Africa.
So they are actually then produced, manufactured broad scale for people with particular genetics on the other side of the pond. Is that not what we're saying?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
But are we also then not suggesting that given that they're profit-making entities, they will conduct studies among populations where they know that their product can be afforded?
True. Well, affordability is a different thing. It's more of a second stage. They will test their drug. I mean, we would do the same thing. You'd go fishing with their fish. And you use one kind of bait where these fish will eat that bait. I mean, that is logic. So we have no trouble with that. And there are a number of pharma who says, yes, we have to be making profit, to invest the profit, to get new drug development. What we are saying is, it may well be that our patients are somehow different. So enroll our patients on your clinical trials, and that be participatory. And I think there are a number of pharmaceutical companies that are very proactive to do that, have been coming to Africa, which is why the clinical research unit, in 2020, there were no clinical trials besides infectious diseases being conducted in sub-Saharan Africa. Zero. Today, in the clinical research unit, we have other sites within Kenya that do research. I can tell about the CRU. 2020, the first study we did was tocilizumab, which was what we used for COVID. Today we have 16 clinical trials, enrolled 300 patients, 300 Kenyan patients, never done before. And we find findings. We have a study in multiple sclerosis. MS is a disorder, a neurologic disorder that causes neurologic dysfunction. It's a disorder of young women. We had 14 patients on this clinical trial out of 154 around the world. Our 14 patients had more disease, earlier disease, but responded better to that treatment than those other 154. Looks like this drug works well for us. So we would want that drug to come to us, but it's quite expensive. So the next step is to say, when the drug is found to be beneficial, what can we do as a population? What can the government do to allow us to have access to these drugs that have been found to be beneficial?
More affordably. The question, though, Prof, is everything that you're saying, I mean, many medical researchers such as yourself must have known this for a long time, that the genetic makeup of people in this part of the world is not the same as genetic makeup for people in other parts of the world. Correct. So why have we never had clinical trials in the field of cancer in Africa at all? And yet we know that, even those who live in Africa also get cancer.
So we've known that different populations, different ethnicities have a different genetic makeup because they came from a different gene pool. But what to do about that was not known because we knew that there are certain mutations, for example, the BRCA mutation. It's been made very famous by Angelina Jolie, right? She had the BRCA mutation. Her mother, I believe, had breast cancer, her grandmother breast cancer. It's quite common in patients of Jewish ancestry. So it has been studied very clearly. The question is, even though we knew BRCA is cancer-causing, we could not stop that. Today we have drugs that are able to ameliorate the effect of BRCA. So it takes a while. First is discovery of the pathogen, discovery of the source, and the ability to block that source which causes the disease. And the question is, what about BRCA in Kenya, in East Africa, in Africa for that matter? The test to do BRCA testing costs about $350. Who can afford that?
Right.
We at AKU would like to set up a genetic sequencing platform where it's affordable for patients to be able to at least get tested. 20% of my patients at AKU, and I'm sure the same thing would be at other places here in East Africa, have a hereditary predisposition. You ask the patient to say, my aunt had breast cancer. Oh yes, my grandfather had breast cancer. Well, have we tested you for the gene? No, it's too expensive. And in the past, when we test you, we couldn't do anything about it. But today we can. So I think your countryman, my president, Barack Obama, says, yes, we can. And the clinical research unit is there to say, yes, we can in East Africa to do the same work that is being done in the West. We just need pharma to support us. We need the government to support us. We need government to be able to fund certain early detection mechanisms for breast cancer, cervical cancer, colon cancer, and so that we can survive longer. I was just talking to my colleague, Dan, before I was waiting for you. 20% of prostate cancer patients in Kenya that we see are below the age of 40. Not seen in North America. But we do not have PSA testing that we can do early detect. What about colonoscopy? 20% of colon cancer patients in Kenya that we see at AKU are below the age of 40. Not very common in North America. Is the federal government allowing us to have colonoscopies at an affordable rate so we can pick them up early? So this way, we increase the cure rate. Those patients who are cured will pay taxes, will be really productive members of society, as opposed to when they come with stage 4 disease, survive about a year or so, cause significant amount of money to the healthcare system, significant amount of pain and suffering to the family as a whole. I think we can change that paradigm with early detection and then providing resources for treatment.
Before I go to the break, I want to ask this question. What's been public perception is that there's an increase in the number of cancer cases in Kenya. So is that the case, or is it that there's an increase in cancer diagnosis in Kenya?
That's a good question. We clearly have more sophisticated technologies, CT scans, PET scans, MRI, where we detect cancer early, mammography for that matter. We are growing older, so the older you are, the higher the risk that you'll have a mutation that will result in cancer. But more importantly, we've also taken up Western habits, high fat, low fiber, low exercise. And clearly we have, if you look at the traffic, there's quite a bit of smog out there and smoke. So we are adopting all the Western habits of congestion, obesity, low exercise. We have stopped becoming Africans like we were, and we're becoming North Americans where we only choose the bad attributes, not the good ones that we had. We give them up. When Japanese moved from Japan to Western, the US, the breast cancer rate, which was low, became very high because obesity increases estrogen. Estrogen is a growth factor for breast cancer. I think the same thing will happen to us. As we live longer, we'll be inviting new pathologies that I think we need to be careful about.
Okay. But then the pushback to that would be that very many of the people who also get diagnosis for breast cancer are very active people. And they're in rural areas of this country. And one would argue that they are eating, those natural foods, the mbogas, organic foods, right?
It goes back to the question is the genetic makeup that we have predisposing us to those kinds of pathologies? And more importantly, though, you could be very young and organic. I just came back from a city, and I won't name where it is. They were selling fruits on the streets, on the roads, as you know very well. And I heard that the use of fertilizer in those regions is significant. Well, we talk about being organic. Well, those potatoes I was about to buy were highly fertilized. So I'm sure what we eat, even in the shambas up there, may not be quite what we think we're eating.
Aga Khan University has established a cancer and clinical research unit, and the founding director is Professor Mansoor Saleh. He's our guest this morning in our Health Friday conversation. We're talking about, clinical trials and clinical research for cancer in this country. And this is the first center to be established, not just in Kenya, but in the region, not just in the region, but in the continent.
There are others who have followed suit, and I think we cannot be the only ones. We should not be the only ones, but I think we've set the mark to say we can do research at the same level as Western countries, and we were FDA audited, the PPB audited us, so we really have to do compliance. As I've told my colleagues, clinical research is not a hobby you do on the side of clinical care, where you see the patient for 6 hours a day, and then on your way home, you say, well, maybe I'll do a clinical trial. We are focused on doing this as part of our genetic makeup to say we want to do research at the highest level so that our data counts with all the others.
Okay. Are you collaborating with all the other centers or even the other research facilities? KEMRI, for instance, Kenyatta University Teaching and Referral Hospital, which also has a unit that is working on cancer. Are you collaborating with those?
Correct. A number of those centers, KEMRI, for example, KUTRH, etc., are just beginning to have a cancer research unit. It is fair to say that the world came to us because we had infectious diseases, TB, malaria, HIV. They had to come to us to do those studies. They did not come to us for cancer. So there were no cancer clinical trials. We have my colleague Chiti up in Eldoret having the ICI Cancer Research Unit, my colleague Sitna here in Nairobi having a clinical research unit. We have to have a platform of many more sites so that we can have a platform where pharma can say, we just not choose one, but many partners. The key is the compliance within this team has to be accurate. Patients have to be eligible for a study because that's what counts. And I believe we have a very good network of establishing clinical research units here within East Africa.
What kind of support are we looking at here? Because just from examples that you've given, where the majority of the drugs that come to Africa for cancer care, where those are being developed, often have networks with governments, organizations. We're talking about CDC, for example, and other bodies that have been established to ensure that whatever research then is being done is complemented by government action in terms of funding and things like that. So here we are, and with clinical trials happening on the continent, which would then lead to advisories on what kind of medication then is necessary to be had here. What kind of support then on this end would be required to ensure the affordability that you speak of and the regularity of the availability of these medicines? What kind of support would be necessary?
You ask a very important question, because besides having a clinical research unit that we have at AKU and other colleagues have within East Africa, it is how efficient are we in getting these clinical trials approved by the system? So the way it works is the PI, the principal investigator, gets a clinical trial from a pharmaceutical or develops their own clinical trial. It's reviewed by the human subject board within the institution, the IRB, to be sure that we are really ethical in the way we conduct the studies. It then goes to the PPB, who review it again, goes to NACOSTI to get it approved, the Ministry of Health to say we can send a sample outside the country for testing, and then you get activated. So we did a study during COVID when it was a life-threatening condition. The WHO, EVREF, the Ministry of Health says it's life-threatening. Let's do all these processes together so that the study could be approved very quickly. The time to activation of a clinical trial, from the time I get the study to the first patient on, was 78 days, nearly a world record. Could have been in the Guinness Book of Records. During the same time, we had 7 non-COVID clinical trials that took us 278 days to get approved, which is like 9 months. Well, if it takes that long to get a study approved in Kenya, the West will have shut down the study by that time, enroll all the patients. We got many more trials, in fairness. Ukraine going through a war time, a number of studies that were being done in Ukraine are now coming to Africa to be done. But as you say very rightly, the government, the regulatory system have to be nimble and swift it does not mean we just approve what came from the West, but we have to have people with knowledge who can review this in a more expeditious manner, not in a parallel fashion whereby we have stumbling blocks that lead to stagnation.
What kind of emergency are we looking at? Because I remember when COVID made its entrance into the world 2020, end of 2019 into 2020, nobody was really quite sure what was going on. There was a bit of fumbling. But then very quickly, there was a congregation of scientists, specialists, experts, big pharma, who came and said, you know what? This thing is killing people. It's crazy. We need to come together and sort it out. Right? And then before long, we saw trials that were expedited.
Correct.
We saw expedited trials, did we not? And then we saw that before long, there were vaccinations, there was treatment, there were solutions that were done. That was because there was an emergency of a situation at the time where populations were at high risk and quick risk. Now, here with cancer, of course, we know that the burden is increasing, but truly, what kind of an emergency situation are we looking at that one would hope would beg then for the kind of emergency action that we saw with COVID?
You know, in the West, we have the war on cancer. We do not have that in Africa. In the West, when you have a very prominent artist, show actor, or even a politician get cancer, they say, I had this, I got cured, I detected early, we've got good resources. Here, we hide cancer under the rug. When you have it, you go to India, you go somewhere else, and we've forgotten. When you come back, you came back. If you don't come back, nobody thinks about you. I think we, as a government, as a society, have to ask our leaders to have a war on cancer, because it is the fastest growing condition above and beyond diabetes, hypertension. And I think we have not done that. And while we believe that we are making progress in the healthcare, and I think we're not making as much progress as we should, we are accumulating risk factors. Age, pollution, fertilizers, our habits, those are all aggregated to really causing trouble. For example, cervical cancer could be cured and could be kicked out of the footprint of Africa if we had vaccination. We know exactly what causes cervical cancer. Well, we do not have as much vaccination going on as we would like to. So I think there is much that the community can do, and ask the government, just like today, when the Gen Z says we want better rights, we want better healthcare, we want less taxes on key commodities that we need for life. I think we should also have a same movement within the population to ask for better healthcare, better clinical trials, and better services for our own health and life.
What research process would we need to conduct in order to understand what the cancer burden is in the country?
You know, tumor registries. Everywhere we have tumor registries where every patient who gets cancer is registered centrally. Now, the Ministry of Health, the National Cancer Institute of Kenya, is starting to do that. Our data is not very accurate, but when we have accurate data, it can really tell us what is the burden of disease and which diseases. For example, if you're up in the Eldoret-Tenwick area, we have, for some reason, either genetic, environmental, diet, we have high esophageal cancer. The highest burden of esophageal cancer is in the area of South Asia. Hot tea, certain kinds of tobacco being chewed, etc. We aren't quite sure why in that particular area, in the Tenwick area, we see that. We somebody needs to go back and check. Is it our diet? Is it our genetics? Or is it some environmental factor? We see this. We have a clinical trial treating esophageal cancer with a very specific targeted molecule that targets a specific protein on esophageal cancer. But the question we're asking is, how come we have such a high burden in that particular region? So tumor registers are important, and we need to go and survey the lifestyle, the habits of patients. I think one thing we need to talk about here is also the stigmatization of cancer. We have a study going on at the moment in breast cancer, looking at stigma in breast cancer. When you do not get chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery, nobody knows, just you know that you have cancer, breast cancer, because it's hidden under your breasts, under your dress. Yet the patient feels the fear that the population will realize I've got something. We believe sometimes, falsely, that breast cancer is infectious, that it can be spread. And then when I give you chemotherapy, you lose your hair, you lose your job, you have nausea, vomiting, go to the hospital, you've got even more stigma. A quarter of our patients with breast cancer that we studied have depression, at least a third have anxiety. That, to me, is a burden that society places on a cancer patient that's already suffering. We need to do something about that. And that's the issue of mental health, where we work with the Brain and Mind Institute at the Aga Khan University to look at the mental aspects of cancer and the stresses that causes. For example, we're studying the first study here in Africa is called the Brain Resilience Kenya study, whereby we're studying 200 patients who are healthy going through stresses of life. We have given them a Fitbit, we do an MRI, we do blood work, we do psychological testing to say, what is the impact of normal stresses of life? And we've added another stressor to say, by the way, we've taken 25 breast cancer patients, 25 prostate cancer patients. As we treat you through your life's journey of cancer, what do those stresses do to you on your MRI, on your blood film, on your psychological testing? To assess how can we build resilience, how can we overcome frailty? And that is the kind of research we do, which is cutting edge. I think we just need to be supported in many ways by the government, by the regulatory authorities, to expedite these kinds of trials.
The funding that one gets for the sort of research that you mentioned, are they grants that are given competitively? And if so, one needs to have knowledge of how to apply for these grants. First of all, recognize that they exist, apply for them, whether it's NIH, whether it is whichever institute, and NIH has very many of them. Do you actually think that institutions of health, like, say, for instance, you mentioned Aga Khan is an institution of health, Kenyatta University, Nairobi University, Moi Referral, do these institutions have the wherewithal to be able to tap from these resources to be able to even begin this process that we are speaking about?
Good question. We're getting better at that. It used to be in the past that somebody from the West would say, I need 100 patients of African ancestry on my study with breast cancer. Can you give me the patient? I would write the grant, you give me the patient, and they'll give you a token of some part of the grant. That's the way it used to be. Today, we say, no, we just want to give you the patient. Let us help you write the grant. So we are participants and co-investigators. And I think we're getting proficient at that. The language of a clinical trial grant is very different. It's very much like poetry you mentioned. Yeah, if you don't write it properly, nobody understands it. It is not competitive. But we are getting better at that. I think a number of universities here in Nairobi and elsewhere are becoming very savvy, developing partnerships with the West, where they allow us to build capacity and we become the principal investigator. So, for example, we had the first study that we did in the CRU with the tocilizumab for COVID. It's approved today with the highest enrollment in Africa. We had a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is like the gold standard. We said tocilizumab is quite expensive, has to be given in the ICU. What could we do in Africa if COVID were to come back and attack the lung? We know that what kills a patient with COVID, at least at the high times of COVID, was the inflammatory response in the lung. The virus is gone, your immune system has killed the virus, but the immune system is now attacking your lung because that's where the virus was. So we said, why don't we just sort of ameliorate the immune response of the patient? We gave a low dose of radiation therapy to the lung, 100th of the dose that I would give for lung cancer. And that was very effective. Low-dose radiotherapy for COVID cost $25. Tocilizumab costs at least thousands of dollars in the ICU. Now, to write that particular clinical trial required a certain amount of language. So we partnered with somebody in the West to say, by the way, how do we do it right? We wrote it together. So I think we developed that skill. It comes with time. And I think we're getting better at it. The more you do it, it's like cycling. You will then be able to cycle and go into a motorbike and then go into something faster. I think we are getting better at it. But we have to be at the start line of these kinds of clinical trials and compete and learn from experience.
Talk about regulation again. What's the nexus between the various bodies? So, for example, drugs are regulated by the Pharmacy and Poisons Board.
Correct.
Research is regulated by NACOSTI, the National Commission of Science, Technology and Innovation. And then the entire Ministry of Health. When it comes to cancer, there's a body that has been established to deal with cancer matters, the National Cancer Institute. What's the next? How do you then, where does KU, the Aga Khan Hospital rather, come in?
So you point, I mean, it is a little bit of a soup. The NCI Kenya is responsible for cancer care in Kenya.
Right.
The PPP, as you say, is the regulatory body. There's NACOSTI. There is always some bodies report to the Ministry of Education, other bodies report to the Ministry of Health, other bodies report elsewhere. I think we need a unified way to be able to all be on the same platform and do things not in silos and not sequentially, but in combination, in parallel, together. That's what happened when COVID came about. Everybody sat down on the table to say, this is killing our patients, they're killing our people, it's costing money to the environment and the economy, let's work together. I think we need a conversation. And my hope is that people listening to Spice today will say, let's have a conversation. We are beginning to have that conversation, but it has to be really accelerated for us to have a place at the platform where decisions are made. Because the decisions are made in the West, we have to be as competitive as our colleagues in the West.
So right now at the Aga Khan University, as you're conducting the clinical trials, who do you deal with? When you, you get the funding, yes, you are conducting this trial, and then you've got a patient who's coming, and you've got a drug that you are using and testing. Must those drugs first be approved by the PPB before you put them into trial? And that means that they are existing drugs. Who is regulating your relationship between the university and the patient, going all the way to whatever outcome? How does that work practically at Aga Khan University?
So the clinical trial drug is called the investigational product because it is being investigated. So either we write a trial, which we'll call investigator-initiated trial, or a pharmaceutical brings a trial. It has to be reviewed by the scientist, by the scientific review within AKU to say, is it really right science? Do we have the right patients? Then the human subject protection body reviews it for ethics to say, by the way, are we... I come from Birmingham, Alabama, where I trained, and Tuskegee, Alabama was not very far away. And you remember, there were hundreds of African Americans who had syphilis, who were observed for nearly 40 years, even when penicillin was available, was not given to them. We do not want to do that anymore. Now, we have some episodes here that you know very well, where people were told you can go to heaven if you starve yourself. Well, that was unethical work, but yet it was done under the guise of being helpful. So we have a Human Subject Protection Board at AKU, at all institutions, to be sure that our studies are ethical and do the right thing for the patient and not just in the interest of science. When that's approved, it goes to the PPB, who reviews it once again, both for science and for ethics. The trouble we have is when the PPB changes a comma here or there, it's going to go back to the IRB and vice versa. So those are a ping pong that results in stagnation. After the PPB approves it, it goes to NACOSTI. NACOSTI says this can be done in Africa, and then the Ministry of Health will certify to say that you can get the medication into the country, or you can send out blood samples for testing. So those are the regulatory authorities. So when I have a patient, by that time, it's all said and done, but it's taking too long from the time I get a clinical trial to time I can put a patient on study. Yeah.
What needs to shorten that time? What needs to happen so that time can be shortened?
Good question. I think we should do things not in silos, one after the other, sequentially, but together. We should have in the US, you have a centralized Human Subject Protection Board. Every protocol goes there. For example, if you have 3 sites conducting the same clinical trial, why can't one Human Subject Protection Board review that study, which has been done in 3 different populations, in 3 different institutions? It's the same protocol. I think we need to have a conversation about how to expedite that. And as you see, it is in our benefit that these drugs come to our patients to be tested to say, do they work for us or not, before we really spend big amounts of money using these drugs. For certain hypertension, for example, the African-American male in the US has a different form of hypertension. The drugs that work for them do not work well for the Caucasians. The same thing should be studied here in Africa on our patients. We finally have units like the CRU at AKU and other places within Kenya where we are as good as the West. We just have to have a regular system, be nimble, and then we have to promote that our population are willing to come and be participatory on clinical trials and should not feel like they're being guinea pigged. This is our chance. And the last thing I would say is every drug I use in cancer today was a clinical trial drug some years ago. Some patient was willing to be part of a study. And the motto of the clinical trials unit at AKU is the drug called hope, Tumaini. If not for me, it is for the people who will come after me. And that is the modus operandi that we, the population, should adopt about clinical research.
Prof, the research community, since we're talking about cancer, let me say specifically the cancer research community, who ensure that they're up to date with the wherewithals of that particular area, of that discipline. The IRBs, NACOSTIs, and all the people up to the ministries, does the research community ensure that these people keep up? Because you're talking of delays. If you have an IRB who don't understand certain things, there'll be a back and forth. It's not that they're being obstructive, they don't understand. If you have people in NACOSTI who don't have, say, the knowledge that you have, there'll be even further delays. What are the steps that the research community, the cancer research community, take to ensure that the knowledge base that they have is the same knowledge base that the people on whom they depend to authorize the operationalization of their projects have?
Yes, people at SPICE want to get me into trouble. I think it is true. Science has moved along.
Moves quickly, yes.
Yeah. And it is true that we may have institutional bodies that have not moved with the times. But it's fair to say that a number of the institutional bodies realize that the membership that I have may not be at the cutting edge of research of things being done today. They may be a little bit behind the scene, but there are modus operandi whereby the Institutional Review Board gets in external reviewers to review a study based upon the new science. I think we have to also accept the fact that our institutional bodies have to grow with the times, and that we cannot have membership that is a membership that's reviewed studies using infectious diseases, HIV, TB, malaria. The things have changed. Just like I have to keep up with what I call precision medicine, where I am not just a breast cancer expert today and a colon cancer expert tomorrow. I target the gene that be responsible for those diseases. I agree with you that we as a society have to also change bodies, bring new membership, bring new blood of individuals who are experts. But I think it's fair to say that we are realizing that we do get external opinions from other external bodies, but then it also causes stagnation and slows the system down. But I think we may, just like we do in the government, renew the people who are responsible for reviewing things that benefit, impact our patients.
Just burn that cabinet as well.
While we're at it.
Prof, if somebody would like to participate in a clinical trial, how do they go about it?
You know, since I'm not a salesman, I do not know the websites, etc. But if they call AKU Clinical Research Unit, they call the AKU number to say, I want to be sent to the Clinical Research Unit. They will talk to Ann Kabuki. She will list you in, will tell you what clinical trials we have, will come and see you, evaluate you, and we have a whole team of individuals. One thing I can tell you is I've been totally impressed by the staff in Kenya, the people we recruited to train. Incredible talent. They are as good, if not better, than the team I had in the US who did phase 1 studies. So I think we have the talent. We have people who are committed to the cause of helping this population. I think we, the regulatory system, the federal government, and also society as a whole has to make sure that we get the best to our people, and clinical trials is one way to do it. So if they call AKU and want to be connected to the CRU, we will take care of them.
All right. AKU is the Aga Khan University. The CRU is the Cancer and Clinical Research Unit. And the person who's been talking to us is the founding director of this unit, Professor Mansoor Saleh. Thank you very much, Prof, for speaking to us. And we wish you all the best as you continue doing this work. It's a noble work.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.